It's December 2nd, 1993. The king of cocaine lies lifeless on a Medellin rooftop, his empire reduced to ashes, his legend cemented forever.
Escobar, who had the blood of hundreds on his hands, died almost defenseless. He'd been shot repeatedly by troops who had surrounded the two-story house.
But Pablo Escobar's story isn't just about his rise to power or his bloody downfall. It's about the mind of a man who defied every law, crushed every rival, and rewrote the rules of power itself.
Pablo Escobar exploited poverty.
But he was doing that not for altruistic, but for very selfish reasons, to make sure that the people weren't selling him out, that they looked upon him as the Robin Hood, and he had places to go and hide then if necessary.
How did a boy from the slums of Colombia become the world's most notorious drug lord? What drove him to commit acts of unimaginable violence whilst portraying himself as a savior to the poor? And what does his life teach us about the dangerous blend of ambition, fear, and control?
Imagine one man ordering the destruction of an aircraft, and well over 100 people on board had to perish because of his one desire to kill one man.
And you're seeing body parts. You're seeing small children, infants, that have been killed simply because their parents were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
And then he went after the police officers that arrested him and had them all killed.
This is the story of Pablo Escobar, a man who gave hope to thousands, terrorized millions, and left behind a legacy as dark as his empire. Through his journey, we'll explore not just the events that shaped him, but the psychology behind them. Because to understand Pablo Escobar, we must step into the shadows of his mind. Before the world knew him as the king of cocaine, Pablo Escobar was just a boy from Rio Negro, Colombia, a small rural town surrounded by mountains and hardship. Born on December 1st, 1949, Pablo grew up in a modest household. His father, Abel, was a farmer, quiet and unassuming. His mother, Hamilda, a schoolteacher, was strict and ambitious. But even in this humble environment, young Pablo's eyes burned with relentless ambition, a hunger for the paper. The streets of Medellin, where Pablo spent his formative years, were no place for innocence. In a society plagued by inequality, crime wasn't just a temptation, it was a lifeline. For a boy like Pablo, who grew up watching the wealthy flaunt their riches whilst his own family scraped by, the allure of power and money was irresistible. So crime was indeed what he turned to.
He initially started robbing gravestones from cemeteries and shaving the names off and then reselling them.
He was known to local law enforcement. He was a car thief. He was a bit of a thug, juvenile delinquent, if you will. That was his background.
Pablo Escobar's life wasn't defined solely by his lack of wealth, but by the lessons it taught him. He saw that the world didn't reward honesty or hard work. It rewarded those who took what they wanted. As he grew older, Escobar began to understand that the law was less a boundary and more of an obstacle to overcome. In Medellin's underworld, smugglers and thieves were local legends, and Pablo was watching closely, learning the trade, learning the game. Psychologists might argue that Escobar's early environment shaped his trajectory. His childhood was a classic case of unmet basic needs. According to Maslow's hierarchy, the relentless drive for food, security, and stability often forms the foundation of ambition. But for Pablo, ambition wasn't just a means of survival, it became a means of control. The instability of his upbringing also left its mark. His father's passivity and his mother's stern discipline created a dynamic that pushed young Pablo towards rebellion. He learned early on that power wasn't handed out, it had to be taken. And in Medellin, the path to power was paved in blood and money. As Pablo hustled for his teenage years, the seeds of his empire were already being planted. He was learning not just how to steal, but how to scheme, how to outthink, and how to dominate. Escobar's childhood might not explain everything about the man he would become, but it does reveal one thing. From the very beginning, Pablo Escobar wasn't content to live in the shadows. He wanted to own them. By the time Pablo Escobar entered his 20s, he was no longer the restless boy hustling for scraps. He had evolved into a man with a singular focus, wealth. But for Escobar, wealth wasn't just a goal, it was a necessity. He didn't want to merely survive, he wanted to dominate. And in Colombia, there was no faster route to power than the booming cocaine trade. In the early 1970s, cocaine was still a niche drug, consumed by the elite in the United States and Europe. But Escobar saw an opportunity to capitalize on its rising demand. He began smuggling small shipments, first by mule, then through clever disguises and hidden compartments. His ability to outsmart law enforcement quickly earned him a reputation as a cunning operator in Medellin's underworld. Escobar's vision extended beyond simple smuggling. He understood that to truly control the trade, he couldn't just be a cog in the machine, he had to build the machine. Partnering with a network of suppliers, traffickers, and enforcers, he laid the foundations of what would become the Medellin cartel. this wasn't just business, this was an empire in the making. And empires require resources. Escobar's desire for money wasn't just about greed, it was about power, freedom, and security. For him, wealth represented the ability to control his destiny and impose his will on the world around him. Psychologists often discuss the concept of instrumental values, the drive to accumulate wealth or status, not for the sake of luxury, but as a means to achieve dominance. This was Escobar's mindset in its purest form. But the road to wealth in the cocaine trade wasn't paved with gold, it was paved with danger. The competition was fierce, the risks monumental, and the stakes life or death. To rise in this world, Escobar wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Bribes were his first weapon of choice. He paid off police, judges, and politicians, ensuring his operations could expand without interference. But when money wasn't enough, Escobar turned to violence, a choice that would define his legacy. By the late 1970s, Escobar wasn't just a player in the trade, he was the game's architect. His network stretched from Colombia's coca fields to secret airstrips and distribution hubs across the United States. At its heights, the Medellin cartel was moving 15 tons of into the US every single day, generating millions of dollars in profit. But the seeds of Escobar's empire carried the roots of his destruction. As his wealth grew, so did his enemies. Rival cartels, local authorities, and even the Colombian government began to take notice. Still, Escobar was undeterred. He saw obstacles as opportunities, challenges as mere steps towards his ultimate goal, to become untouchable. Building an empire was only the beginning for Pablo Escobar. The true test of his ambition came in maintaining it, and in the world of survival was a game of blood and power. For Escobar, this wasn't just business, it was war, and in war, there were no rules. By the late 1970s, Escobar's Medellin cartel had grown to a multi-billion-dollar operation.
Pablo Escobar's organization was huge. He had the money to make it huge. Forbes magazine came out with their richest men in the world, and he was right near the top of the list. So right off the bat, you knew that this man was not a millionaire, he was a billionaire.
But success came with enemies. Rival cartels, rebellious associates, and law enforcement threatened his growing empire. Escobar had a solution for every challenge: plata or plomo, silver or lead, bribe them or kill them. The murders started small: local rivals, disloyal partners, and government officials who refused to be bought. But as Escobar's power grew, so did the scale of his violence. Judges, politicians, police officers, journalists, even civilians became targets. Entire families were wiped out to send a message: defy Escobar and you wouldn't just die, you'd disappear. This level of violence wasn't random, it was calculated. Escobar used fear as a weapon, a tool to control not just his enemies, but also those within his own organization. Psychologists might call this instrumental aggression. Violence used not out of rage, but as a means to an end. Every killing served the purpose to consolidate his power, to eliminate threats, to send a message. But Escobar didn't just rely on brute force. He was a master of psychological warfare. One of his most infamous acts was the bombing of Avianca Flight 203, a commercial plane carrying 110 passengers, including an informant he believed was working with the Colombian government. The explosion killed everyone on board, including innocent civilians. For Escobar, collateral damage was just a part of the equation. This act of terror wasn't just about eliminating a single threat, it was a demonstration of power. Escobar wanted the world to know that no one, not even ordinary citizens, was beyond his reach. It's a chilling example of psychopathy in action, a lack of empathy paired with an extreme willingness to achieve one's goals at any cost. As Escobar's violence escalated, so did its impact. Colombia became a nation under siege. Public bombings, kidnappings, and assassinations turned everyday life into a nightmare. People lived in constant fear, unsure if they'd make it home by the end of the day.
And you're seeing body parts. You're seeing small children, infants, that have been killed simply because their parents were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
For Escobar, this chaos wasn't just a byproduct of his rise, it was his strategy. By creating an environment of terror, he ensured that those who might oppose him stayed silent. But violence on this scale comes at a cost. Escobar's reputation as a ruthless killer began to eclipse his image as a businessman and philanthropist. Allies became wary, enemies multiplied, and the Colombian government began to see him not just as a criminal, but as a threat to national stability. Still, Escobar remained defiant. In his mind, he wasn't a villain, he was a hero, fighting for his place at the top. By the 1980s, Pablo Escobar wasn't just a drug lord, he was a legend. To some, he was a ruthless killer. To others, he was a savior. Escobar understood that power didn't just come from fear, it also came from adoration. And in the barrios of Medellin, where poverty was a way of life, Escobar made himself indispensable. He built homes for the homeless, football fields for the children, and schools for communities long ignored by the government. Entire neighborhoods owed their existence to his generosity. In Medellin, Escobar wasn't just a criminal, he was El Patron, the man who gave them hope. For the poor, he was a Robin Hood figure, stealing from the rich and giving to the desperate. And Escobar made sure everyone knew it. His acts of charity were never private. They were public spectacles designed to cement his image as a man of the people. But this philanthropy wasn't truly altruistic.
Very selfish reasons to make sure that the people weren't selling him out, that they looked upon him as the Robin Hood, and he had places to go and hide then if necessary.
Pablo Escobar was a Robin Hood to the people in Medellin because he helped a lot of poor. He built churches, gave a lot of money to people, so people idolized him. You know, they were guarding him, they were hiding him.
For Escobar, generosity was a weapon, just like violence. Psychologists might argue that Escobar's philanthropy was rooted in narcissism. Narcissists crave admiration and recognition, often seeking ways to project an image of themselves that aligns with their idealized self. For Escobar, the idealized self wasn't just a kingpin, it was a protector, a father figure to the disenfranchised. But this image stood in stark contrast to the reality of his reign. While Escobar built homes with one hand, he destroyed lives with the other. His cartel's violence spared no one, not even the people he claimed to protect. Bombings in Medellin killed countless civilians, many of them from the very neighborhoods he helped. His manipulation was masterful. He gave just enough to be loved, but took more than anyone could measure. One of the clearest examples of this duality was his offer to pay off Colombia's national debt, an amount equivalent to billions of dollars. On the surface, it seemed like an act of patriotism, a gesture of goodwill, but beneath it lay a darker motive. Escobar wanted to rewrite the narrative. He didn't want to be seen as a criminal. He wanted to be seen as a leader. Escobar's contradictions were part of what made him so dangerous. To the poor, he was a hero. To his enemies, he was a monster. And to himself, he was both. His philanthropy wasn't just about helping others, it was about solidifying his power, creating a shield that no bullet or law could penetrate. Pablo Escobar spent years building an empire that seemed unstoppable. But empires built on violence and fear rarely stand the test of time. By the early 1990s, the cracks in Escobar's kingdom had become impossible to ignore. His enemies were multiplying, and his once loyal allies were abandoning him. The man who had controlled Colombia with an iron grip was slowly running out of time. The beginning of Escobar's downfall came with his greatest mistake, his imprisonment in La Cathedral. Officially, it was a deal with the Colombian government, a luxury prison in exchange for handing himself in, but in reality, it was a fortress designed to allow Escobar to continue running his cartel from behind bars. For a time it worked. Escobar threw lavish parties, made business deals, and executed rivals, all from the comfort of his so-called prison. But when the Colombian government discovered the truth, they tried to move him into a real prison. Escobar responded the only way he knew how. He escaped. The escape marked a turning point. Escobar was no longer an untouchable kingpin. He was a fugitive, hunted by the Colombian government, rival cartels, and the United States. His network of allies began to crumble under the pressure. The Cali cartel, once his partner, turned against him, funding the vigilante group known as Los Pepes. This group, made up of Escobar's enemies and former associates, waged a brutal campaign to dismantle his empire piece by piece. For the first time, Escobar was truly alone. His once vast network of loyalists had shrunk to a handful of supporters. His wealth, which once seemed infinite, was now buried in fields and burned by rivals, and his power, which had once extended across continents, was now confined to the city of Medellin. As the walls closed in, Escobar's mental state began to deteriorate. He became increasingly paranoid, moving constantly to avoid capture. He cut ties with anyone he couldn't trust, even close associates and family members. Psychologists might describe this as a state of hypervigilance, a symptom of chronic stress and fear. The man who once inspired fear in others was now consumed by it. On December 2nd, 1993, Escobar's reign came to an end. Tracked by a Colombian police task force and aided US intelligence, Escobar was cornered in a middle-class neighborhood in Medellin. In a desperate attempt to escape, he fled to the rooftop of a safe house. But the man who had eluded capture for so long couldn't outrun his enemies forever. He was shot and killed in a firefight, his body left on the rooftop where he fell. For Colombia, Escobar's death marked the end of an era. The man who had once brought the country to its knees was finally gone, but his legacy remained, a legacy of violence, corruption, and fear that would take years to unravel. For some, his death was a victory. For others, it was a reminder of the costs of unchecked ambition. Pablo Escobar's fall wasn't just the end of a man, it was the end of a myth. The Robin Hood figure, who had once been idolized by the poor, was revealed for what he truly was, a man consumed by his own greed, power, and paranoia. His story is a cautionary tale, a reminder of how far ambition can take you and how much it can destroy along the way.
Well, I remember him giving me a lot of love, being at home with me and my family. He was a very good man with me. I received a lot of love from him, and that's the father that I knew at the beginning.